Everybody. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to be handing over now for the workshop on how NHS procurement works. Lee.
Hello. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining this session on how NHS procurement works. Firstly, I'm Lee Gutcher. I used to work for North Central London ICS, and a few months ago I moved to a remote patient monitoring company called Lucy, but still keep my links with the NHS and our fantastic panel members as well. We have got a fantastic session ahead of us, a really insightful conversation and discussion about how NHS procurement works. But before we dive into that, we'll do some introductions first. So, Charlotte?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charlotte Roberts, and I'm an Associate Director at Health Innovation Kent, Surrey, Sussex, one of 15 health innovation networks around the country, and I'm a clinician by background.
Afternoon, everyone. My name is Mick Corty. I'm the Director of a small procurement shared service here in North Central London, day-to-day looking after the procurement for 4 trusts in North Central London, but also part of the wider procurement network, supporting both the ICS system here in North Central London and the wider NHS economy.
Hi everyone, my name is Nick. I'm a doctor by background and an entrepreneur, and having launched a software company about a decade ago, I've worked with many procurement departments up and down the country, and hopefully I'll be able to share some learnings.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aaron Prasad. I'm the Senior Category Lead at PPS with Mick. I focus primarily on the procurement of technology and services with a strong focus on collaboration and innovation in healthcare.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. Okay, so as you can see depicted here, we are all aware that NHS procurement is a very complex and it's a long and winding road, and this is probably simplifying a very, very complex process. But there is 6 high-level areas that we, as a panel, we discussed, and I'll go through each of those areas now. I'm going to dive into 3 of those areas. So, on the procurement process, at first, an NHS organisation will need to identify their needs. And then there is a period of pre-market engagement and market engagement. And then there is the tendering process, followed by evaluating the tender bids, then awarding the contract, followed by implementation and monitoring. Now, we've got a finite amount of time. Obviously, we could be here all day discussing NHS procurement. So there's 3 areas which we're going to concentrate on, which is market engagement, tendering, and evaluating bids. And I'm sure myself and the panel will be very happy to take any questions about any of the areas at the end of the talk and also in the networking session as well. Okay, so let's start with market engagement. So many of these questions that any time that I've been out and I've gone out to networking events or different conferences, etc., one of the main questions that I get about procurement are these questions that I'm going to bring up now. But as I said, there will be time for some questions at the end, so please do start to think of them now. But one question that we have is about what is pre-market engagement and why is it so important? So, Mick, do you want to kick us off on that?
Yeah, thanks, Lee. So procurement in the NHS is a pretty dry topic, and I have brought with me the small Bible, all 670 pages, that goes through the regulations underpinning procurement. Now, I wouldn't suggest for a second that any of you read this, but I guess it's just to indicate the level of the size of the rule book that all NHS organisations as public sector authorities have to abide by. So sometimes the procurement processes can feel a bit laborious and can feel a bit unnecessary. But, take it from me, what we try not to be in procurement is policemen saying these are the rules. What we try and be is facilitators and enablers to allow the NHS to get the best solutions. And pre-market engagement is a really important part of that. And it can take two forms, but basically the objective of both is the same, and that is to allow the NHS to assess what's out there in the marketplace, to uncover and discover innovative technologies particularly, and even maybe refine its thinking around what it should be buying. Now, the two forms of market engagement, I guess, are formal and informal. Now, formal market engagement is something that will happen as a precursor to a tender. Lee's already mentioned the T word, and unfortunately, the NHS, as I said before, is a public sector authority. The public sector authority rule book on procurement is anchored around competition. So at some point, you are going to find yourself answering a tender. It's as simple as that. But formal pre-market engagement is a precursor to a tender. So what that means, quite importantly, is the specification or the requirements document that may end up in a tender scenario isn't necessarily cast in concrete. A formal market engagement will be notified to the marketplace, usually via something called a prior information notice. It's very important, if you're not already familiar with dealing with the NHS or public sector's procurement generally, that you become familiar with the primary portal on which notices, and you'll hear the word notice used a lot, on which notices are advertised, and that is Find a Tender Service, FTS. You can Google it, you'll see it. There is another portal called Contracts Finder, but only some smaller contracts are advertised on that. Everything basically is on Find a Tender, particularly contracts that are above the threshold. The current threshold for competition is £139,000, including VAT, contract value, not annual value. So you can see that most things of any significance will be advertised. The prior information notice will come out typically and will be seeking players in the market who may have a solution or a suggestion for a particular set of requirements, which will be framed in the prior information notice. But this is an opportunity to come back and maybe suggest how your solution could meet the aims or the objectives that are laid out in the prior information notice. The second form of market engagement is the informal, and that isn't necessarily won't necessarily be publicised. This is where you need to be trying to make sensible connections with elements of the NHS where your solution may find a valuable home. I'm going to hand over to Charlotte because the Health Information Network is a key part of this and has a really important role to play. But what I will just add before I do that is you don't sell the tech, sell the benefits of the tech. That's what's really important. And if you're not familiar with the way the NHS writes business cases, there are plenty of sites with template business cases on them. Again, Google it, find an NHS England template business case for a digital solution and look at it, and you'll see it's all about the benefits to the patient primarily, but also to the clinicians working with that solution. People may have a passing interest in the IP or the patents or whatever it is that makes your tech so special. But what's really important is what are the benefits and how it can work in a live environment, clinical environment, to benefit both clinicians and, most importantly, the patients. But I'll let Charlotte talk a little bit about the HIN now, if that's all right.
Thanks very much, and very happy to talk about this side. So we in the Health Innovation Network consider ourselves as the honest brokers, so more on the side of that informal process. And I think one of my sound bites for today is it is never too early to start the procurement conversation. Whether that is with potential partners or with supporting organisations like the Health Innovation Network, who are there to help and are a free resource up to a certain point to help with value propositions and helping mapping the impact of an innovation. So we are here across the country, across the country with local knowledge, the ability to say, oh, you need a little bit of feedback from a GP? Lovely. I know someone who'll be very happy to help you refine that, co-design those products and those solutions. So pre-procurement engagement with suppliers is essential to enable customers to understand what is feasible before going to tender, and really, really important. So please do use the Health Innovation Networks, who have a universal offer for supporting innovators to help that process and to guide you along the way.
Great, thank you. And that looks like some light bedtime reading you've got there, Mick.
Yeah, I haven't got all the way through it yet.
Cool, okay. So I hope that was helpful to set the context of pre-market engagement. So the next question that we have is, what strategies can startups use to get onto the radar of NHS procurement teams during the pre-market engagement phase? Nick, Aaron, do you want to start us off with that?
It's actually very good the way you distinguish between informal and formal, because for a startup founder, I think the informal stage is by far the most important one, especially if you have an innovative piece of tech that the market might not yet know it exists. So honestly, is about getting out, doing what founders do very well, which is hustle, and get to meet people, and then work with organizations like the Health Innovation Network to really define who your customer is, because NHS organizations are huge and have different stakeholders, who the influencers are, and get in front of them, get to speak to them, and get to try out the value proposition, refine it as you go, and definitely communicate the benefits, not the IP.
I'll get it right eventually. No? Okay, take three. Thanks, Nick. From a sell side and the soft market engagement perspective, that makes a lot of sense. The other piece to consider is the highly regulated formal notice component of pre-market engagement. Just for some context, procurement currently is undergoing some significant transformation, probably the biggest transformation we've ever seen in public procurement, hence Mick's wonderful bit of bedtime reading there. Pre-market engagement is becoming a formal component of the procurement process. As a consequence, we're becoming increasingly regulated, and you'll find yourselves responding to prior information notice or market engagement, formal market engagement, as you attempt to sell into the public sector. So some things to keep in mind if you really want to push ahead and maybe edge ahead is to really look at what's being communicated in that request for information or that prior information or pre-market engagement phase. The trusts will do their best, or any public sector organization will do their best to communicate their needs. And what you'll identify as subject matter experts yourselves, you know the market really well, probably better than any of us do internally. As a consequence, you will find gaps. You'll find gaps, and you'll be able to collaborate with us. And I think the key word here is we'll try to be proportionate. You should try to be authentic. It's not necessarily a game of attempting to manipulate the system and say, oh, if you add this line in, only our solution can do it. At that point, we're distorting the market, and it wouldn't be fair, transparent, or proportionate on our part to include that little bit, and we'd open ourselves up to risk of challenge. But if you communicate authentically with us and collaborate, ask interesting questions, you'll find yourselves put in a position to put your best foot forward come the tender stage. And just to reiterate what Mick said, bear in mind it is not a bid, and what happens as a consequence of that pre-market engagement session, you may find it fizzle out, or you may find they go in a different direction, but it's all part of that mind share game. I think that covers everything I wanted to talk about on this point. Thanks, Lee.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, that's really helpful. Okay, so I'm going to move us away from the market engagement, and we'll continue on our journey down the long and winding road, and we'll move our way onto the tendering phase. So, what is tendering? And Mick, can you provide a high-level view of the main procurement processes?
Yeah, surely. So tendering is the means by which any contracting authority, and that could be an NHS organisation, or it could be an ICB, it could be a trust, or it could be an ICB, any legal entity that's part of the public sector will be known as a contracting authority and will run tenders to arrive at either a specific contract for the provision of some goods or services, or for the establishment of a framework. And I'll come on to frameworks in a second, because that's probably the most interesting area, certainly when it comes to technology solutions, technology providers. But if I take the first of those first, which is where an NHS organisation is looking to establish a specific contract for its own use with a supplier, then there are currently two primary routes, and they're going to be collapsed into one when this baby comes into law at the end of February. But right now there's what's called an open route and there's what's called a restricted route. Both of these, as with most things, are advertised on that portal I name-checked earlier on, Find a Tender. Interestingly enough, also, as part of the change in the regulations, all organisations of scale, and what they've determined as being an indicator of that is all organisations that spend more than £100 million a year with external providers of goods and services. Now that will be all trusts for sure, and it will be all ICBs. I can't imagine there's any NHS organisations that are going to be spending less than £100 million a year with external goods and services provider. They have to publish a pipeline, or they will have to publish a pipeline, again, on Find a Tender service. So come the end of March, beginning of April, you should be able to start to see people's procurement pipelines. It may be a bit of an imperfect process this year, because it's the first year it's been done, and obviously there's going to be learning on all sides as we get to grips with this, but that's an important heads up, if you like, of what might be coming down the line. That aside, when an NHS organisation is doing a tender, it will advertise the specifics of that tender by something called a contract notice, that word again, notice, and an open tender is, as the name suggests, is open to all. Everyone can respond and put a bid in. I would say that this is pretty unusual, and for the obvious reason. With an open tender, you could receive bids from providers that really are either misunderstanding the requirements or not qualified to meet the requirements, but you still have to evaluate and assess every bid you receive. So most organisations would run the second of the two examples, which is a restricted tender, which basically means it's a two-stage process. There will be a contract notice that advertises again the requirements and what the organisation and the client organisation is looking for. You will answer a bunch of technical and some organisational questions, which will then be evaluated to assess whether you are going to be taken through to the restricted stage, which is actually where you make your commercial offer and your submission to the requirements of the tender. Now, I haven't spoken about frameworks yet, and frameworks are actually the most important procurement route, because a framework is an agreement that has been advertised by what is known as a framework host. A framework host will be someone like Crown Commercial Service, who are a central government resource, or the London Procurement Partnership, who are a London-wide resource, or Shared Business Services, who are another national resource. And a framework agreement will establish a set of vendors that are pre-qualified and have earned a place on the framework that then NHS organisations can come to that framework and make a selection from the framework without having to go through either an open or a restricted process. So what you will see is some open and restricted processes. In fact, the majority of open and restricted processes in tech for the NHS are actually for the establishment of a framework, as opposed to what I said right at the beginning, which was to meet the specific contract requirements of one organisation. NHS organisations obviously really prefer the framework route, hopefully for obvious reasons, because it means you're going to a set of suppliers that have already been accredited by the framework host and that have won a place on that framework. Now, I might have segued into the next bit there.
Lined it up beautifully.
Right.
Yeah. So
okay.
obviously we've talked a lot about the framework.
Yeah.
So just to recap on there, so there's open tendering, there's restricted tendering, and then there's frameworks as well. So in terms of the frameworks, how can organisations and startups join one of the accredited frameworks? We have a slide which has all the different frameworks on there, and we can bring that up shortly. But Aaron, do you want to take us through that?
Fab. Thanks, Lee. So I haven't quite got my head around the color coding and color coordination. Just for my own edification, by show of hands, who here is representing a technology solution that they're hoping to sell into the public sector at some point? Oh, fabulous. Okay. And then just for further information on my part, how many of you are currently on a procurement framework? Is it G-Cloud 14? Yeah, it's a lot of nods for G-Cloud 14. Fabulous. That's exactly correct. Is what we wanted to hear. So for those who aren't aware, as Mick described, the procurement framework is, we're framework first, right, when we buy. It's your key to getting in to sell to the public sector. Because, as Mick's described, a lot of the legwork around accreditation, around ensuring you have your right ISOs, you have your right terms and conditions under the contract is already completed. So how do you go about joining one? One, please, if you are on G-Cloud, check your inboxes, make sure that the organization or the person within your organization who has registered you on G-Cloud either remains and keeps on top of it, or it's transferred to a third party or a mutually accessible inbox, because good grief, I have seen some very disappointing circumstances where suppliers have found themselves not on G-Cloud anymore because they failed to respond to the latest G-Cloud iteration. As Mick's described, right, we're going through a change at the moment. So come February, when the new legislation comes into place and comes into force, you will see that our pipelines will be published. And Lee, if we can show us this really interesting slide. This is a living list, so by all means do take a photograph. What this shows at the moment is NHS England centrally has described which organisations build compliant procurement frameworks that meet all those asks about ISOs, about IG, about all the social value, all those things that we deem really important. They're going to publish their pipelines. Keep an eye out on the Find a Tender service and set alerts up, etc. Maybe set a note in your diary after we finish talking now that says, come February, the end of February, early March, go have a look online, find the pipelines, and start seeing what their intentions are to publish. Because ultimately, these organizations, or whatever the future version of this looks like, are probably your golden ticket to making sure you get onto the right procurement frameworks. Keep an eye out and set alerts up to make sure you're getting those notifications in your inbox when they go to market, and run a regular sweep around that. The other component is where, for those of you who aren't on a framework, or perhaps are on a slightly challenging framework to buy through and you're not selling through it, you can consider third parties. We have a lot of contracts in the NHS that are actually not procured directly with the innovator or the technology solution. They're procured instead via a third party. I won't name any names, but you'll probably know them all. A reseller. So if you can establish a commercial relationship with a reseller, they can go in on your behalf and contract and flow through an agreement so that we gain access to your great technology without you having to navigate necessarily some of the trials and tribulations of getting onto a framework. But for more on getting into a framework, Nick's probably well positioned.
Thank you. One thing to note, there's a lot of them. So, and really, if you're running a small company, you can't get on all of them. So you just need to choose a few that are best fit for your organization. And keep an eye out for their renewal, stay on them, and they're really straightforward when it comes to getting to apply to join one, and it's like a medium difficulty exam, right? Whereas tenders are, at the harder end. So, it's worth investing in a couple, your time, do a good job, and then once you're on there, it's just a tool. Nobody will come directly, or very few will come directly and say, yep, can we sign a contract, right? It's all the engagement that leads to this, and then a discussion with a contracting authority as to which of the frameworks to purchase from. We'll get in more detail on how to, win and how to answer those difficult questions that come up.
Great, thank you. Yes, that's really helpful.
I think, can I just add something to that?
Yeah,
Lee?
please do.
I think it's, if you've got a digital solution, it's definitely worth looking at the relevant NHS England pages, where what used to be NHS Digital and now folded into NHS England, they actually accredit specific frameworks for digital technology. So this isn't mandated, but it is absolutely strong guidance to CIOs and CCIOs and the like that actually all technology solutions should be bought from an accredited tech framework. So I think it's definitely worth looking at those pages on, and we should have probably put the link up, I didn't think about it. It's definitely worth looking at those NHS England, NHS Digital pages, and you'll see. So, for example, I'm not sure there's any EPR providers in the room, but there is only one framework now that's going to be accredited for EPR solutions, and that is a framework that's driven by LPP. So, if you're not on that framework, you will not be selling EPR solutions to the NHS, full stop.
And LPP being London.
And LPP being London Procurement Partnership. In some areas, there is more than one accredited framework, because the framework hosts, to a degree, compete a little bit. And NHS England's doing a big exercise now. This list is quite new and quite novel. This is the first time, in the last 12 months or so, the NHS England has started to accredit framework hosts. There are many, many more framework hosts out there than these 20. I can assure you there's probably several hundred. But even within this 20, in some particular areas, then there may only be 2 or 3, or in one instance, one framework host that's accredited. So you need to see which framework host best suits your needs.
Thank you, Mick. And any EPR providers. Number 7, London Procurement Partnership. Great. Okay, so another question on tendering then. So what are some of the common mistakes suppliers make when responding to NHS tenders, and how can they avoid them? So Charlotte, I'll start with you.
Yes, so there are many pitfalls, but we are learning, and there are ways to address those. So the 3 that I wanted to mention are, one of the pitfalls is thinking about a product and not a pathway. I'm sure all of you have developed the most brilliant product in the world, and I can't wait to hear all about it through my LinkedIn later. However, in the NHS and health and social care, we have pathways. So being able to talk about how something fits into a pathway amongst everything else, the context, that's incredibly important. The second is to take a value-based approach. So important to think about the value that innovation brings to a health system, not just the unit price. And that could be value to the patient, to staff, to the system, to net zero ambitions. There is a lot of ways of defining value, and again, seek help from local organizations, local partners, if you need help in articulating that. The final pitfall I was going to mention is there are some exceptionally engaged and enthusiastic clinicians out there. But as one myself, I can tell you, I have not had any education about procurement in my medical training. And as brilliant and as much engagement and involvement, co-production you want from clinicians, make sure you say to them before it goes too far ahead, why don't we bring procurement into this and not to get too far down the line? And I'm sure my colleagues would support that as well. So bring procurement in, and you may have to tease that out with your enthusiastic clinicians. Don't dampen their enthusiasm, but just help them, because you'll probably know more relatively about procurement. So don't let them go too steaming ahead. And I'm sure my colleagues will pick up on that too.
Mick?
Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, no, I think I definitely would echo that, and possibly that's a little nice lead into what I was going to say, which is the mythology around pilots. Don't get carried away with a pilot. In the eyes of this thing, there is no such thing as a pilot. All there is a small, short-term contract that may lead on to something else. If someone's talking to you about a pilot and saying, oh, this could lead to X, Y, Z, and you are not familiar with a framework that's going to allow that to happen, then that is exactly where you need to do as Charlotte says, and say, well, whoa, how do we structure this pilot in such a way that it's actually going to work for your intended consequences? Because, as I say, from a contracting perspective, there is no, the word pilot isn't recognised, so please be careful about the mythology. We've seen many, many pilots that have come to an end where we weren't actually able to contract easily with the pilot provider. And that goes even if the pilot is quote unquote free of charge. So be very wary about that. Most tenders you encounter will be what we call further competitions within the framework. So the framework typically will, as we've spoken about at length, will have a number of providers on it. And when an NHS organisation or other contracting authority comes to use that framework, the means by which they select the preferred bidder will be a further competition. But what I'm about to say goes for the other two routes, the open and the restricted, as I said earlier on. The key thing is make sure you read all the instructions really carefully and answer whatever it is that's being asked. Many times we see people answering a different question or thinking actually what is meant by the question. So please, all questions are scored and evaluated. And if you don't answer the actual question being asked, that could be to your detriment. That said, don't be afraid to ask questions. All procurements should have a very clear period for asking what are typically known as clarification questions. And it's amazing how many people don't take the opportunity to ask clarification questions. The questions will be shared with all participants, but always on an anonymous basis. So no one knows who's asked what question. So, this is a real opportunity. And mistakes are made, and sometimes clarification questions will change the course of a procurement. So, at that point, it's still, bids are not submitted. Once bids are submitted, then things become very difficult, very different, and very difficult. So that would be my other advice to you. Certainly, feel free to ask as many questions as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'm just conscious of time, but Nick, Aaron, did you have any comments you wanted to make?
Yeah. I can mention briefly a couple. There's a lot of mistakes that suppliers make. The first one is going for a tender when they're not the best fit, or when it's not for them. Tenders are expensive on your time, so take some time to zoom out and really decide whether you really want to embark on that journey or not. And the second one is repeating the question when answered. So, as I said earlier, tenders are hardest end of an exam, and a lot of the times there'll be a question and then there's just a rephrasing of the question in a nicer sort of way, but that doesn't answer the question. You need evidence. You need a lot of evidence to make sure that you score highly, and that's I think a very common mistake.
Thanks, Nick. Elaborating on your point there, I think it's really important to re-emphasize that a procurement tender is like an exam. So what I find is a personal bugbear when we get bids in from people who've clearly worked really hard to get the right, to put their best foot forward to win a piece of business. But you found one or two individuals that have leaned on internally might have just taken the question and frankly copy-pasted it into a response, which is very frustrating when we know how much work you put into a response. So consider the evaluation criteria. From our perspective, we give you the answer. We say, to score maximum points on this question, the criteria looks like this. Give examples, talk about value, do all of these things that we need you to do. So as you're reviewing a bid to go back in or towards the end of the submission deadline, do go back and review your answers and say, actually, have we done this component here? Have we applied this methodology they've requested? Is the right attachment in there? Are they going to have to go rooting around to find the answer that we think is obvious? I know it might seem silly, but that we need to repeat ourselves, but don't write in, see question 2, the response is in there, pull it back out and reiterate it again. Give us the opportunity to give you the maximum score, because that's what we're all rooting for you to do the best you can. And I think that it's not combative, it's collaborative. I think that's the key takeaway. Thanks, Lee.
Great, thank you. That's really, really good advice and some tips there as well. Okay, great. So we're going to continue moving on to the final point that we're going to talk about today. So we've, just to recap, we've discussed market engagement. We've just been talking about the tendering process. And now we'll move on to evaluating the bids. Okay, so I'll come back to you, Aaron, on this one. So can you explain how the NHS evaluate bids to ensure that suppliers deliver both quality and value and not just the lowest price? This is one of the main questions that I get asked all the time.
Thanks, Lee. No, Lee, you know we only give it to the lowest price bidder, right? That's everyone wins. Everyone knows. You put £1 bid in, you win it every time. No, but seriously, we construct procurements in a way that we don't want a distorted competition. We don't want someone to come in with almost a vexatiously low bid or a bid where they've not understood what we call it, at least in the old language, we used to call it an abnormally low tender. It's probably got some exciting new name in Mixed Handbook over there. But we're really clear when we publish a tender what the breakdown is. And the breakdown of qualitative questions, social value questions, information governance questions, 10%, 15%, other percent, and then whatever remains, we align to the cost component, and there'll be a cost model. If you don't understand the cost model or it's not clear, do ask clarifications around that. But we communicate through that table or whatever methodology that they've set it out in, where our priorities lie. If it's a piece of technology where the main concern is information governance you'll see will have a higher percentage weighting. It's really important that a procurement comes out with the right answer at the end of it. And as a consequence, the emphasis of where our attention is going to be in the evaluation process is really important. I go back to Nick's great analogy. If you remember back in school, hopefully not too many years ago, you were probably taught by your teachers, focus on the questions with the most marks. It's all well and good you write an essay, but if it's only worth 2 marks, you've wasted your time. You've only got so much time and energy and resource to pump into a bid. We really try hard to communicate to potential bidders as they complete a bid. This is where our focus is. And sometimes it will be on lowest price. But a lot of the time, focus your energy on what we're trying to communicate. And if it's not clear what we're communicating, just ask a clarification question. I think that's the key takeaway. Thanks, Lee.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I've got one final question to ask the panel, and I'm going to open up to the floor if anybody's got any questions for our fantastic panel here as well. So we've talked a lot about evidence. So Charlotte, can you share with the audience about what evidence do suppliers need to provide to demonstrate the solution's effectiveness and long-term value?
Yeah, absolutely. So and the short answer is it can vary hugely depending on what type of product you are, what stage you're at, whether we're in a pandemic or all sorts of other things. The best thing to do is seek advice And there are a range of organisations, NICE, MRHA, NIHR, as well as the Health Innovation Networks, and you can access all of those through the NHS Innovation Service, who'd be very happy to advise you on the evidence standards and similar where they exist for certain things. So of course, for clinical innovation, clinical research evidence that proves the clinical efficacy and predicted value of the innovation in a controlled setting is an incredibly important foundation, but also verifying the innovation through real-world evaluation is incredibly important. And when I say that, I mean a combination of activities. It could be quality improvement, implementation science that helps increase the buyer confidence that a product or solution will deliver the described benefits in their system. I don't want to know what something works in a generic system. I want to know how my lovely little community hospital in Brighton is going to work with that innovation. Can you describe the outcomes on the intervention or whatever your product is in a way that your customer values? The challenge for innovators is often not proving that innovation works and is cost effective, but understanding how to implement it in the NHS so it delivers the promised benefits. And that could be across all sorts of things: health economics, return on investments, the different settings in which you've tested, impact on inequalities, net zero, many of the things which we're going to see come in more and more in the legislation over the next year as well. So the short answer is it varies hugely, but come and speak to Health Innovation Networks and other partners to understand how you fit into that and where to start. And if you need you've got gaps, how can we help you fill those?
Great. Any other comments, or if not, no?
No, I think Charlotte did touch on something there that we've not really mentioned, which is some of the wider things that you'll need to consider, things like carbon reduction plans and social value. And these are SMEs are not exempt from these requirements. So you do need to think about, and again, they're all just a Google away, but everyone was going to have a carbon reduction plan, and that means every supplier. And most procurements will have element of social value as a evaluation criteria that should be worth something around 10%. So again, SMEs can really flourish in this area because you may be able to work with local communities or whatever in a way that perhaps the big boys can't. So please do bear in mind that there's other aspects. The other thing I would just mention, I thought about I didn't mention when we spoke earlier on. Is if you see a pass-fail question in a tender, that's a big flag on that. Because if you see a pass-fail question, that means it's not scored. You either pass it or you fail. And if you fail, you're out. So if you see a pass-fail question that you think is unreasonable or you're uncertain about what it means, that's definitely a clarification question right there and then. Because
it's a clarification question, but also it goes back to your point, Nick, as well, about potentially not going for bids for tenders absolutely. That it's not suitable for you as well, and just for the sake of applying. So
that's right.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you. I'm going to open up to the audience. So if you've got a question you would want to ask our panel, then please. Okay. Let me bring the mic down.
Are you able to hear me at all? Yeah? Okay. So as an SME who are their products are on the framework, how can you make sure that you are then incorporated or being seen when bids are going out on local procurements?
I think the answer to that is you have to make sure you fully understand the framework mechanics. So if you're on a framework where the prescribed route to awarding a contract is mini competition, you should be receiving invitations to submit offers automatically. And if you're not, that's a question for the framework host. Some frameworks, and our friend G-Cloud 14 falls into this camp, have a slightly more convoluted framework award process. And G-Cloud 14 uses a keyword filtering exercise. And I guess you need to ensure that in that example, the keywords you've used in your service specification are the ones that customers are likely to use when coming to order a similar product. But it's hard to give general advice because each framework, the mechanics can be slightly different. But by and large, if you're on a framework, then you should be receiving offers to bid. And if you're not, that's probably a conversation with the framework host to understand why perhaps you're not.
Great. Any other questions? Okay.
Hi, I've just got a question about RFIs. So which part of this, are they identifying the need or are they market engagement? You can spend quite a lot of time completing an RFI, it go in, and you never see anything ever again about a future procurement activity. So is a bit of advice really. Should they be completed? Do you have to complete them? If you're then going to tender, what's kind of your perspective and view?
So an RFI will normally be part of a formal market engagement process, and an RFI is just that, it's a request for information. It's a double-edged sword because obviously if you answer the RFI, then you may be able to influence the subsequent tender. But I stand to be corrected on this, but I'm pretty sure that you're not answering an RFI shouldn't impact on whether you receive a tender, because an RFI is not part of a formal two-stage tendering process. It wouldn't, it would be called an invitation to tender. An RFI is just that, request for information. So, answer it because it will showcase your tech and maybe you'll influence it. But if it's very onerous and you don't feel you need to answer it, then it shouldn't actually close any doors to you by not answering it.
What does RFI stand for?
Request for information.
There we go.
It's sometimes called expressions of interest as well.
That's why I know it as, yeah. Cool. Okay, I think we've got time for one last question. Cool.
Thanks, Lee. I guess a question for Aaron or Mick, please. So a lot of trusts are going through mergers at the moment. If you've gone through a competitive process at Trust A and you've won and subsequently Trust A merges with Trust B, is that opportunity or is it a risk? Can you then expand your offering to the merged entity? And if so, what are the rules around that? Sorry, it's quite hard to find the info. Thanks.
Okay, so
Nice,
we've got live examples of this happening around us right now. Right, there are different types of merger, and this is all public domain stuff. So I'm not compromising anyone. Very recently, Camden and Islington Mental Health Trust merged with Barnet, Enfield and Haringey Mental Health Trust. That was technically a merger, and what that meant was both those trusts disappeared and a new entity, North London Partners, emerged. In that case, pre-existing contracts are all novated into the new organisation, and the new organisation has to make a choice where it's relevant over which solution it wants to go forward with, presupposing, of course, that where it has different solutions, it may want over time, and this will be a journey of a few years, I suspect, to align its technical offerings. The other type of merger is also something we're seeing in North Central London, and that is where one trust essentially takes over another trust. That is what's happening with the Royal Free and North Middlesex. Subject to Secretary of State approval, I should say, on the 1st of January. And in that case, North Mid will cease to exist and the Royal Free will just get larger, will be expanded. In that case, all the obligations and liabilities that North Mid had, including contracts, will pass over to Royal Free, and those contracts will stand. It'll be up for the Royal Free then to decide whether it wants to try and amend those contracts as the contract owner, to try and exit them early, typically with the supplier's agreement only, that would be, or wants to wait and do some sort of competitive process further down the line. So if you're a provider of tech to an organisation that is merging, then, unless there's very specific words in your contract that give some fairly draconian powers to the trust, which don't normally exist in NHS contracts, then, that newly emerged organisation won't have the simple right to turn you off, to be blunt. They have to go through a bit more of a fair and equitable process. So it is an opportunity as much as a threat, is what I would say.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so just to recap and to summarise, and then we'll finish up here. So the notes that I've made is that the NHS procurement is long and complex. It's a winding road. I know we've tried to simplify it here. And then just a couple of the points that I've picked up from the different stages that we discussed. In the market engagement, I think the importance of building relationships with the NHS is really important. It's something I picked up on there, along with many other things. In the tendering section, I think advice to join one of the frameworks, I think was coming out quite strong. And then some of the mistakes that suppliers often make is clinicians running ahead with a product without knowing the procurement process. Suppliers not asking questions. I think your advice, Mick, was if you don't understand the question, then please ask. It's a tendering process for you and for the NHS Trust as well, so use that to your advantage. Nick, you mentioned about suppliers going for tenders when it's not really suitable for them as well. So really assess whether it is a suitable tender for yourself and for your product. And then I think, Aaron, you mentioned about making sure that you signpost your answers to evidence in your bid as well. And then obviously we discussed the evaluation as well. And thank you very much for all your questions. Please join me in giving a round of applause to our panel, who have been absolutely fantastic. And yeah, thank you for staying and listening to how NHS procurement works. Thank you very much.